Hi, hello, and welcome to Rebel Unicorn Crafts. Today, we're going to be making these DIY date night scratch cards. These are great for a Valentine's Day gift or even just to help spice up your quarantine life so that there's a little more mystery and variety. I know in quarantine, that has been my biggest challenge is I'm just tired of making all the decisions. I'm tired of figuring out what I want to eat for dinner. I'm just tired. Decision-making rants aside, I did a bunch of experiments on this so that we could figure out the most ways to do this, so pretty much anyone can do it. The initial research that I saw showed using a crayon, some dish soap, and some paint. I don't actually have any crayons, even though I have a whole studio full of supplies, so I wanted to try a few different things here. You can see on my first test card, I used a beeswax bar, I used some chalk, I used melted beeswax of a different type, some oil pastels, and then I even just tried soaking the paper with linseed oil, and then I treated it either with two different paints, and then I also mixed some soap into each one in one of the tests just to see if that did change the texture, because I want that kind of scratchy feeling to these cards. For these tests, I just did whatever the blocking medium between the paper and the paint was going to be, and then just the paint itself. And on some of these, I did 2 to 3 coats to try to cover up that heart I had drawn underneath as much as possible, and it didn't completely cover it up on some, but I wanted to get a couple coats on there because obviously you want to obscure whatever you're going to have as the scratch cards. And then I evaluated. Some of these didn't work at all. For example, the beeswax bar, which I thought would be the most similar to having a crayon, and it only worked when I actually did add the soap, but it was kind of like it left streaks. The paint itself, like it was gummy. I don't know how to quite explain it. The chalk worked better than I expected, as did the oil pastel, and the melted beeswax also worked pretty well. And even the linseed soil had some aspects that worked, but I wasn't quite satisfied with this because you could still see things through it and it needed a little bit more testing. In my second round of tests, I changed a few things. One, I changed the paper. I wanted it to be the paper I was actually going to be printing my cards onto rather than watercolor paper like the first round. I thought that adding baking soda would give it kind of a grainy texture that would allow it to be scratched off, but for some reason the baking soda separated and actually rose to the top, and I just mixed baking soda and paint. I didn't add water or anything like that, so I was a little bit surprised because I wanted it to be thick so it would cover but also kind of crumble. And then I also tested trying to melt the beeswax more evenly on there, and I added in tape because I thought maybe that would be the simplest solution. Paint often scrapes right off of paint. So let's finish scratching these and evaluate. Now, I could have just told you what my top few suggestions are, and I will still do that, but I wanted to show you this whole process to show you that there are a bunch of different ways that this actually does work. In essence, what you're going to need is a barrier to the paper, so something that is not going to absorb and let the paint actually soak into the paper. Then you're going to want some sort of paint that you can layer that isn't going to be super gummy, and that's pretty much it. So after this round of testing, what I found was that the tape actually did work quite well. The baking soda did help on some things like the oil pastel and the melted crayon for the feel, but I was worried about a few things like with the tape. If these got bent in some way, would they just peel right off? And specifically, I had my husband do some testing during this, and when he was scratching some of these, his instinct was to just try to peel the paint off, especially when it was on the tape. So while I really like that and that's a good solution, I think for an easy way to do it, it might not be the best one because I don't know if it's durable and I don't know if they'll get the same experience when scratching these off. Since I eliminated one of my beeswax things, I wanted to put another wax in there, and I actually took just a candle. It was a scented candle, and I used that, and it worked even better than the other waxes I had. I don't think it was 100% beeswax, and maybe that had something to do with it. So after this round, my takeaway was that the tape and the candle performed the best. I narrowed down the resist part, so I knew I wanted to use the candle or tape, but I didn't want to have to add 100 layers of the metallic paint as I had seen, because even with 3 or 4 layers, you could still see the hearts. So what I ultimately decided to do was to paint a really thin layer of a matte type paint, like a craft paint, over these so that it would create a barrier, a visual barrier, and then I could put a metallic layer on top of that. I tried a couple different colors for backgrounds, and then I also tested out a few different metallic paints to see which were the best to use. Ultimately, I decided between 3 different things. I liked the candle wax on the back because it was the easiest to apply and it seemed to have the most consistent results. I tried putting red underneath to be kind of Valentine's-y, but you could still see the hearts a little bit through. I tried black with 3 different paint types and tried scratching those off. The top ones are more of a artist grade acrylic, and the bottom one is meant to be more like a metallic foil looking one. It's more of a solvent, and it has that feel. And this only required 1 layer of each thing, so that really reduced the amount of time, versus you can see in this next test where I did the candle backing with just doing the paints, it didn't work quite as well on the solvent style one, and it would have taken so many layers to cover those hearts with the other one. So this is the paint that I ultimately decided I liked using with the black backing. Alright, so that concludes the testing part. So as you can see, there are all sorts of ways you can do this, but here is exactly how I did it. Here are my supply recommendations to start with. The first is I found that a paraffin kind of soy-based candle had the best consistency for actually resisting and protecting the prize portion. A craft paint to help obscure the actual prize portion. Don't use artist grade paint because it's too flexible. Use something like this. I like Craft Smart for a lot of my projects because it's pretty cheap. Then there are a ton of options for gold paints. My preferred one for this project specifically was this Liquid Leaf because it did coat things nicely in one shot, and so I didn't have to do multiple layers, but it is hard to clean up and it's a little stinky. So if you prefer to use something else, I also tested with this Flash acrylic gold paint, and that worked pretty good. And I also tested with the Artist Loft, and if you just do 1 or 2 coats, it still works pretty well with that, but you don't get quite the same kind of crumble effect as the other 2. But you have options. Step 1 is to create some sort of scratch card background or template. You could definitely do this by hand, but I decided to do this on the computer so they would all be basically the same and a size I wanted. So I made these at about 5 by 4 inches each. I added a little bit of decoration, then I made a key, and each one of these has slightly different recommendations, so there are actually 4 different cards here. And then I arranged hearts in different numbers across these and saved this several times so there were multiple configurations of the same cards with different heart numbers on them, so you really didn't know exactly what you're going to be getting once you covered them all up. Feel free to do your own thing, but if you want to use what I did, I'm going to have a link to the PDF in the comments below for you to use. Step number 2 is print or create them on at least a cardstock paper. So make sure you don't use just normal printer paper, because when you actually go to scratch, the paper is going to crinkle. So pick something thicker like a cardstock paper. If you're doing these by hand, you could also do them on a watercolor paper. I would just make sure it's a smoother version of watercolor than the real textured stuff. Step number 3 is to add the wax or any sort of resist that you're using to the area you need to protect on the scratch cards. And you just really want to make sure you get good coverage, so I actually tried to make sure that I pushed down pretty regularly with pressure, and I went in a few directions and added some circles, so I was really getting into all the grains of the paper, so I'd be covering all of it, all of the part that I wanted to conceal. Step number 4, use a matte craft-based paint in order to actually conceal the prize on the cards. Specifically use a matte paint or maybe a chalk paint, something like that. Don't use an artist grade paint, because those are going to be more flexible when they dry and they won't have quite the same fun scratching experience. Step number 5 is to add the metallic paint on top of the black paint. If you're using this liquid leaf like me, it is pretty fumey smelling, so make sure you're working in a ventilated space. And you're also going to need something to either clean your brush with, like mineral spirits, or use an old brush that you don't care about, because this does not come off with just soap and water. But cover those completely with not too thick of a layer, but so that you get a nice coverage. Personally, for me, since these are handmade, I kind of like that there are rough edges to things, so I left mine that way because it's the look I like, but you can be as careful as you want. And that pretty much wraps it up. So step number 6 is to let these dry. I would let that metallic paint dry for at least 24 hours before you cut these up and scratch them off to reveal what date night you're going to have. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had fun making the scratch cards with me, and actually we're going to be doing number 6. We got 6 hearts, so we're going to be learning to make pasta from scratch. Technically we've done this so far already together during quarantine, but I want to learn how to make tortellini or ravioli, so maybe that's what we'll tackle tonight. Let me know what date night you ended up with in the comments below, and I hope that you have a magically creative day.